Welcome to this data analytics tutorial covering transaction analysis using pivot tables and charts in Excel. In this activity, we are using the real-life checkbook data from the City of Somerville, Massachusetts for 2013 to 2016. The City of Somerville data we are using is older because we are using a real data set, and this is the only data the city has made available. For this tutorial only, we are using a small 22 record data set. For the actual activity, you will be using the full data set, so your answers for the activity requirements will be different, but the process will be similar. For this tutorial on pivot tables and pivot charts, we will be demonstrating using Office 365 Excel for Windows. Other versions of Excel may be slightly different. Excel for Mac is mostly the same as Excel for Windows, except for some small differences in appearance. Any notable Mac differences will be pointed out. Also note that there may be many ways of accomplishing the same thing. We are just presenting one way here. Start this activity by opening the Excel workbook containing the dataset. In general, for each of the requirements in this activity, create a new pivot table in a new worksheet. Name each new worksheet as Requirement 1, Requirement 2, etc. Format the dollar amounts in each pivot table or pivot chart using the accounting format with 0 decimal places. Format non-currency numbers in each pivot table or pivot chart using the number format with 0 decimal places. Requirement 1 asks, from 2013 to 2016, what was the total spending in each of the 4 calendar years? The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table icon. In the dialog box, accept the default range for the pivot table by clicking OK. Double-click the New Worksheet tab to select it and rename it Requirement 1. For Step 5, in the Pivot Table Fields panel, click and drag Check Date down to the Columns box. It will expand to include years, quarters, months, and check date. Notice that the column labels for the years 2013 through 2016 now appear in the pivot table. If we wanted to expand these dates to include quarters, months, or days, we could click on any one of the date hierarchy icons next to each year. We don't need to do that for this pivot table, so we will leave them as they are. If the Pivot Table Fields panel ever disappears, you can bring it back by clicking anywhere in the pivot table. Now, drag the Amount field from the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Values box. Sometimes the Amount field in the Values box will be set to Count instead of Sum. To change the field to Sum, click in the Fields drop-down menu, select Value Field Settings, and then select Sum and click OK. For Mac users, instead of a drop-down arrow, click the information symbol next to the Values field. The Pivot Table Field dialog box will open rather than a drop-down menu. Click Sum and then click OK. Next, we will format the data. Select the amounts in the pivot table and right-click. Select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, click Accounting and then select 0 decimal places. Click OK. Requirement 1 is complete. We can see the spending for the City of Somerville for each of the 4 years. Requirement 2 asks the question, in each of the years 2013 to 2016, how much was spent in each of the 3 categories of government: education, general government, and public works? Begin by clicking anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table icon. In the dialog box, accept the default range for the pivot table by clicking OK. Double-click the New Worksheet tab to select it and rename it Requirement 2. Next, click and drag Category of Government in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the rows box. Drag Amount down to the Values box, and drag Check Date down to the Columns box. If your pivot table shows the values field as Count, click the Field drop-down menu, select Value Field Settings, and then select Sum and click OK. Remember, Mac users, instead of a drop-down arrow, you'll click the information symbol next to the Values field. In the Pivot Table Fields dialog box, click Sum and then click OK. For Step 5, select the amounts in Pivot Table and right-click. Select Number Format. Then select Accounting Format with 0 decimal places and click OK. Requirement 2 is complete. We can see what was spent in each category of government for Somerville for each of the 4 years. Requirement 3 reads, in 2016, which account, use the field Account Description for this answer, was the largest in the general government category? Where in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table icon. Accept the default range for the pivot table by clicking OK. Rename the new worksheet Requirement 3. Now, drag Category of Government in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Columns box, Account Description down to the Rows box, and Amount down to the Values box. Remember to check that the Values field shows Sum of Amount. Next, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box. Now we are going to filter the pivot table to show only the amounts from expenditures made in 2016. Open the Years filter menu and select 2016. Then click OK. Mac users, if all of the years are already selected in the filter menu, you will need to deselect the Select All box before selecting the year 2016. Now we will sort the pivot table by the General Government category column to find the largest account. To do this, right-click an amount in the General Government column, select Sort, and then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Select the amounts in the pivot table and right-click. Select Number Format, then select Accounting Format and 0 decimal places and click OK. Requirement 3 is complete. We see the pivot table has been filtered to show only amounts from 2016, and it has been sorted from the largest accounts to the smallest accounts in the General Government category. Remember, your pivot table will have many more accounts in the General Government category for 2016. Requirement 4 reads, in 2016, who was Somerville's largest vendor as measured by total dollars spent? How many separate payments did the city make to this vendor? What was the average amount of each payment to this vendor? Begin by clicking anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table icon. Accept the default range for the pivot table by clicking OK. Rename the new worksheet Requirement 4. Next, drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box, Vendor Name down to the Rows box, and Amount down to the Values box. Again, remember to check that the Values field shows Sum of Amount. Now drag Amount in the Pivot Table Fields panel 2 more times down to the Values box. Next, we will change the Value field setting for the second Sum of Amount column. We will change it in a new way. Right-click an amount in the second column of the pivot table and select Summarize Values By. Then select Count. Now right-click an amount in the third Sum of Amount column in the pivot table and select Summarize Values By. Then select Average. Open the Years filter menu and select 2016. Then click OK. Mac users, if all of the years are already selected in the filter menu, you will need to deselect the Select All box before selecting the year 2016. To format the first column, select the amounts in the pivot table and right-click. Select Number Format, then select Accounting Format and 0 decimal places. Click OK. Repeat the formatting steps for the third column. Select the amounts and right-click, select Number Format, select Accounting with 0 decimals, and click OK. Right-click an amount in the first column and select Sort. Then select Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 4 is complete. For the year 2016, we can see who was Somerville's largest vendor as measured by total dollars spent. We can see the number of separate payments the city made to the vendor, and we can also see the average amount of each payment to this vendor. Requirement 5 reads, how much in expenditures did Somerville have related to property, plant, and equipment? Use the field Item Class for this answer in the General Government category in each of the years 2013 to 2016. How much in expenditures in each of those years were related to repairs and maintenance? Begin by clicking anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table icon. Accept the default range for the pivot table by clicking OK. Rename the new worksheet Requirement 5. Next, drag Category of Government in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box. Drag Years into the Columns box, Item Class into the Rows box, and Amount into the Values box. Open the Category of Government filter menu and select General Government and click OK. Mac users, if all of the categories are already selected in the filter menu, you will need to deselect the Select All box before selecting General Government. To format, select the amounts in the pivot table and right-click. Select Number Format, select Accounting Format with 0 decimal places, and then click OK. Requirement 5 is complete. For our small data set, we can see that Somerville did not have any expenditures related to property, plant, and equipment in the General Government category. Note that your larger data set will show these expenditures. We can see, however, in this pivot table how much in expenditures in each of the years 2013 through 2016 were related to repairs and maintenance. Requirement 6 reads, copy the pivot table that shows Somerville's expenditures in each of the 3 categories of government for the years 2013 through 2016 from the Requirement 2 worksheet. Prepare a pivot chart using the line chart type of this information on the same worksheet. Analyze the pivot chart and summarize the trends. We will begin by adding a new worksheet to the workbook. Click the plus icon at the bottom of a worksheet. Now rename the new worksheet Requirement 6. Navigate to the Requirement 2 worksheet and click in the pivot table. On the Pivot Table Analyze tab, open the Select menu and click Entire Pivot Table. Press Ctrl+C or Command+C for Mac on your keyboard to copy the pivot table. Navigate to the Requirement 6 worksheet and press Ctrl+V or Command+V for Mac on your keyboard to paste the pivot table. Now we are ready to create a line chart. With the pivot chart still selected, on the Insert tab, click Pivot Chart. Windows only. Mac instructions will follow. In the Insert Chart dialog box, click Line and then click OK. Mac users only. Unlike Excel for Windows, the Insert Chart dialog box will not appear after clicking the Pivot Chart button on the Insert tab. Instead, a pivot chart will be automatically generated, in this case, a clustered column chart. To change the chart to a different chart type, click on the chart, then click the Change Chart Type button on the Design tab. Select Line and click the first 2D line option. Back to Windows and Mac users. The last step is, on the Design tab, click Switch Row and Column. Requirement 6 is complete. We copied the pivot table showing Somerville's expenditures in each of the 3 categories of government for the years 2013 to 2016 from the Requirement 2 worksheet, and we prepared a pivot chart using the line chart type of the information on the same worksheet. Mac note: this chart will look slightly different for Mac users because field buttons don't exist in Excel for Mac. That concludes this data analytics tutorial covering transaction analysis using pivot tables and charts in Excel. This video was created by Dr. Wendy Tietz. Thanks for watching.